welcome back to another video feature for the Immersive World's Handbook. Today I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada at the Mob Museum, which is one of the new interactive museums in Las Vegas that gives you a history of the mob from the beginning to the modern day period and a lot in between. So I'll take you inside and show you a look at this interesting interactive museum here in Las Vegas.
So here, as I take you inside the Mob Museum, I want to focus on a number of elements that I think relate to the reasons that the new Mob Museum is such an effective space for immersiveness and for theming. I'll focus on 20 elements, and these range from everything to the material culture, the signage in the museum, to aspects of the guests and his or her role in the space. So let's take a look at some of these now. The first of these is putting the guest in the picture. I think for me a lot of theme spaces that do this are effective because they give you the sense as a guest that you truly are part of the space. So in this case, they're trying to bring you into the picture of the mob story with this signage here at the beginning of the museum that says you are under suspicion. This is one of many elements I think that the Mob Museum uses to put you in the picture. The second of these is appealing to a balance of emotions. And I think this one is quite significant given the obviously dark and violent nature of this particular theme that the Mob Museum has focused on. You'll see in later cases, if you visit the museum, in later rooms, that in fact much of the violent history of the mob years, the various hits and assassinations, are portrayed in quite striking graphic detail. But in this case here, which begins in a room on the third floor, just as you enter the museum and begin the experience, the guest is shown, I guess, a lighter side of the mob, organized crime, and all the violence and everything associated with it by giving you a lineup. And as you could see at the bottom of the picture, it's quite important. They're trying to, again, focus back on this first point about how you relate to the space with this signage here. So I think it's one way of lessening the blow of some of the violence that is to come later in the museum. And the third aspect of effective immersion is the use and mixture of signage and various graphic elements. And in this case, as you could see here, early in the museum, there is signage that appears to be just chalk on a wall, but this is actually, I think, a key part of the first aspect of this museum, which talks about some of the characteristics of individuals in the mob and what might lead them to take on a life of violent crime and mayhem as is portrayed in later aspects of the museum. What's key coming up here, you'll see, is very near the end of the museum as they focus on going after the mob, is a use of visual signage that I think is also equally effective. So a combination of these clearly is used to great effect at the museum. 4 is creative uses of material culture, not unrelated to the uses of signage and visual elements. This is towards the end of the museum where you see this representation of some of the newer aspects of the mob and organized crime. In fact, you might say some of these elements portrayed don't directly relate to the mob, but relate to the opening up of organized crime. And I think this particular use of material culture is creative, but it's also quite stunning because it gets you to see, in a literal and symbolic sense, the map of organized crime around the world. The fifth of these elements is using color to appeal to the emotions. And in this particular case, you're seeing a series of rooms that appear at the end of your visit to the Mob Museum. You can see here the images of Al Capone and other gangsters. What's effective about the use of red is its various connotations. I think for me it harkens back to some of the speakeasy references that we saw earlier during the Prohibition years of the mob. And of course it has connotations of violence and connections here to the mob violence. And as this is brought to a conclusion, red really becomes the prominent color in many of these rooms. The next element is effectively connecting the spaces. And this is particularly important because in many theme spaces, there isn't an effort to seamlessly bring together the individual spaces. This often happens in theme parks, for example. The Mob Museum, though, I think is quite effective in taking you through the journey and also in effectively connecting one space to the next space along that journey. The next of these is cultivating that sense of discovery. And I have an image here early in the museum where you see filing cabinets and this graphic on the wall about connecting the dots. And I feel that this effectively gives the visitor a sense of excitement about the journey into the mob world that is to come later. Following this, we have representing the local. And quite effectively, the Mob Museum references, in obvious ways of course, the legacy of the mob as it relates to Las Vegas. And many of the interactive activities they have in the museum, and also the signage, and one room in particular that you'll see later, do a quite incredible job of portraying Las Vegas's own role, and thus heightening the local visitors' connection to the exhibitions, because presumably they're also in Vegas to take part in the many exciting things beyond the legacy of the mob at the Mob Museum. The next element is appropriate interactivity. And here I'm interested in the various ways in which the Mob Museum uses interactivity to better connect the guest to the narrative of the space. In this example here, you could see a typical card table that has a slot machine type game. And in this example of interactivity called Betting the Future, the point is that the guest uses the interactivity to familiarize him or herself with some of the elements of the museum that they've already witnessed, and also to highlight some of the ones that are coming up later in some of these exhibitions. And for me, effective interactivity uses technology, uses forms of immersion, uses even entertainment and fun as a way to connect with the guest, as a way to extend the storytelling of the space, and as a way to really create more immersion and effective theming. I think it shouldn't be used in just haphazard ways, or in ways that are vicarious and just basically give the guest the excuse of technology. Here's another example of some side-by-side ones I witnessed in the museum, talking about cheating in Las Vegas gambling, which of course has been a big part of the mob history, and also talking in this case about some of the key figures in the history of Vegas. Here are some examples of interactivity with weapons, and this is one area in the museum where I had a little bit of concern and wondered if the immersion was taken too far, but of course violence was a key part of the mob's history. And this last one I thought was quite effective and fun at the same time, and this was an immersive exhibition from one of the rooms that focused on the Vegas history of the mob. The next of these is the idea of you are there, really. And what I mean by this, if you look at this particular exhibition here, this is a wall that replicates the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But what you discover at the end of an interactive section, a video, is that this actually contains pieces of that actual wall. And the second one here is a courtroom. And I have to admit, when I saw the interactive movies that were playing in this great stage set, I thought it was just a set. What the guest discovers quite differently at the end of the show is that this is one of the actual courtrooms among many courtrooms back in the day when mobs were put on trial for their criminal activities. 11 is referencing the outside world. And here I have a scene, the very last room actually, that you see before you exit to the gift shop, and this references the outside world of mob movies and mob folklore and culture in the world of popular culture. The next is an appropriate use of metaphors. The first of these here that I reference is the Spiderweb, and they're talking about the various connections that take place in the world of organized crime, in the world of the mob, and in this case the Spiderweb, I think, is an effective use of metaphor to express and give to the guests a sense of legacy after they leave the museum, and they hopefully will remember that particular metaphor. The next of these is highlighting familiar feelings. And here I reference one section of the Mob Museum where they focus on the bygone era of Las Vegas, and of course its connection to the mob and its many criminal activities. And for me this was effective because of their combination of familiar elements of decor, of movies, of images, of color patterns, palettes, and aspects of material culture in what became a very effective use of familiarity. And 14 is heightening the stakes. In this case, the guest is asked to take part in a covert investigation of the mob, and I think the way that they achieve this in the museum effectively puts the guests in that sense of the secrecy involved in these covert investigations of criminal activities. The next of these is inviting introspection. And here I'm interested in the ways in which a themed or immersive space could ask the guest to think about his or her own consequences were they in a situation like this. You can see here with bribery and money, they're asked to do so, and then the guest is asked to take part in this interactive exhibition here in which they're asked, would it be possible for him or her to go into protective custody were they in one of these situations? So all in all, an effective way to get the guest to think about his or her connection to the space. 16 is extending the theming. And here, as you can see, the theming takes the guests from one space to the next. And this is an example from the stairways as the guests moves throughout the spaces. And coming up here, you'll see an image of how the typical lineup theming that you might see in criminal situations is also portrayed in a bathroom space. And as I mentioned earlier, these are great ways to theme the entirety of the space, not just one or two aspects of it, but to give the guests that overall sensation that they really are part of mob history. And lastly, of course, we see the theming extended to the very extensive gift shop that you see just after you exit the museum. And the next is providing for givebacks and takeaways. I talk about this concept in the Immersive World's Handbook, and basically here I'm focusing on some of the ways that the Mob Museum asks you near the end of your visit to the museum to tell your own story. I'll have a secondary video on this aspect, and I do encourage you to see that because this is one important way that the guest can record his or her own voice and leave an impression about their visit to the museum. 18 is considering difficult and dark topics, and quite obviously, the topics considered in the Mob Museum are difficult and dark, and not unlike some of the other traumatic museums you might visit, like a Holocaust museum or a tolerance museum. You're really forced to consider the violence, the greed, the corruption, and the many other elements that make up this history of the mob. And I think this is important because one could sugarcoat this history and present it in a more palatable way, but as I mentioned earlier in this video, the Mob Museum presents many violent and graphic images and situations that certainly cause one to see, in a thematic and immersive sense, the real legacy of the mob and other forms of criminal activity. The next is providing endpoints, yet also leaving things open. And here's an image after you leave the courtroom and hear the very telling video about some of the previous attempts to shut down the mob with prosecutions, and you see what happened to some of the characters involved in those stories, thus an endpoint. At the same time, when you see the end of the museum and you see this exhibition that talks about some of these current crimes that are part of organized crime, such as piracy, identity theft, cyber crimes, real estate fraud, blackmail and extortion, and many other forms, I think the guest is asked basically to think about the consequences, and in a sense, there isn't an endpoint to this journey through the Mob Museum, and I think that's okay. That's not just about extending the story of the mob, it's also about extending the theming beyond the finality and the endpoint that might be provided in a museum like this one. And the last of these is telling a familiar story in a new way. And this is quite key, and I think for me this is why the Mob Museum is so successful. It's not boring, it's interactive, it's immersive, and it certainly isn't telling the story in a subtle way, in a staid way. It's telling it in such a way that I think the guest can really appreciate the various sides. As the museum puts, there are two sides to every story. So the guest sees the many sides of the mob, its history, its culture, its representation in pop culture, and it sees it in a very telling way and in a way I think that sets some standards for other museums to come. So I hope you've enjoyed this focus on these 20 elements of immersion and theming at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada.
I hope you enjoyed this tour of the Mob Museum here in Las Vegas, and come back and listen to additional video features for the Immersive Worlds Handbook.